All right, well, let's get started. So again, welcome everyone to the RCR Wireless News, Service Assurance in a NFV and SDN World webinar. I am your host, Dan Meyer. I'm Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. Today, we'll have a discussion looking at trends in the service assurance market as the telecom space moves towards greater use of software in controlling and offering network services. Joining me today on this webinar is a star-studded cast that includes Greg Collins, who's the founder and principal analyst at Exact Ventures, Chris Rice, who's the VP of Advanced Technologies and Architecture at AT&T Labs, Vikram Saxena, who's from the Office of the CTO at Cable Markets at NetScout, Ehab Mana, who's the Solutions Architect at EXFO, and Bala Fikadov, who's the Director of Marketing for NFV at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, or HPE. The plan for today's one-hour webinar is that I'll provide a 10-minute overview on the topic, taking some insights from a story looking at service assurance that we will have available via the rcrwireless.com website here shortly after this webinar concludes. We will then have Greg Collins from Exact Ventures to provide a 10-minute analyst overview of the market. Following Greg, we will have Chris Rice come on from AT&T to provide some insight into how the carrier is working to ensure service assurance remains a top priority as AT&T moves towards greater software control of its network. We'll then follow up with Vikram from NetScout, Ehab from EXFO, and Bala from HPE to each provide a 3-minute overview of their company's connections with the topic there. If all that goes according to plan, we should have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for Q&A from the audience. So for those of you who are listening in, if you have any questions on the topic for our panel members, please send those in using the questions tab, and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions for any specific panel members, please include their name in the question. We'll make sure we get those to the right person. Also, we will try to speak as loudly and clearly as possible, but if for some reason we are not coming in clearly, please check your sound settings on your computer. We will also have a copy of this webinar posted to our website shortly after we are done here today, so you can also catch up with it there as well. All right, let's move on from there. So with that, here's just a quick slide just showing some information on RCR Wireless News. Basically, we've been covering the mobile telecom space since really before the launch of commercial wireless services back in the early 80s, and continue to do so today on a daily basis. All right. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is connected with a featured report on the topic that will be available from our website shortly after this webinar concludes, and you can download it there. Okay, and of course, there I am. So, all right. So to dig in a bit on the topic here, I think we're all pretty much aware of the growth and the explosion of NFV and SDN and software and cloud in the telecom space. I think along with perhaps 5G and IoT, these are the new acronyms that are pretty much taking over the telecom space. As you can see here, a recent report from IHS Markit predicts that the service provider NFV market is set to surge from 2.7 billion in 2015 to 15.5 billion by 2020, with NFV software comprising 80% of that total, or about $4 out of every $5 spent on NFV. In addition, the firm claims 11% of NFV revenue will come from new software and services, 16% from NFC infrastructure, and as you can see, 73% from existing marketing segments, primarily from virtual network functions. So obviously, analyst predictions can be a little over the board or kind of all around the board at times, but obviously I think we're all aware that the NFV market, SDN market, is really set to surge in the telecom space. A more bold and perhaps more encompassing report came from TBR, which predicts the NFV and SDN market are expected to hit 158 billion by 2021. And they had mentioned that a lot of that's going to come from early adopters such as AT&T beginning to ramp up investments in the ecosystem. A lot of those companies, as we'll hear later from Chris, have become really pretty active in the space. And as we move towards into the 2020, 2021 timeframe, we'll see a lot more investments in the ecosystem. Also, a recent survey released by the Linux Foundation's OPNFV project noted that only 6% of the more than 90 telecom operators questions did not have an NFV strategy, which was an improvement from the 14% from last year. So obviously, more and more operators are becoming aware that they need to have some sort of virtualization strategy moving forward, either in their plans or moving on those plans here in the near future. So as we're doing the report there, talking to carriers and also vendors and analysts out there, one thing we did realize that there are still some concerns from carriers in terms of this move towards virtualization. One of those was that as we're moving away from the legacy models of real tools that operators and more specifically their engineers were used to using in terms of handling service assurance, is moving more towards a code-based or software-based platform. So a lot of concerns there with the retraining of employees and just how they're going to handle this move towards this new virtualized world. Also, there was some concern in the near term about terms of support for what will be virtualized hybrid deployments, which are basically operators running legacy systems and new virtualized systems at the same time. It does seem like that operators and the vendors out there are working towards making sure that these can be supported for up to the next decade, but obviously at some point operators are going to want to switch away from the legacy systems towards their virtualized systems to cut down on redundancy in their networks. So that will be quite a bit of time frame for that to happen, but that is a bit of concern still for the operators out there. Also, what we heard from some carriers was a lack of guidance from vendors in terms of the position in driving the virtualized movement instead of legacy models, where vendors were always moving to roll out new technology. So this is definitely a new service model for everybody moving forward. I think we've seen in past technology evolutions, the vendors were always the one driving the evolution, and that also provided them with the ability to kind of provide insight of what was going to happen. Well, with this new move towards virtualization, it seems like this is a lot of it being carrier driven, which is kind of putting vendors a bit on the back foot in terms of staying up to date and up to speed on what's happening in the market. AT&T's e-com project was mentioned by many as a significant driver in the space. So we'll hear more from Chris on that topic as well. But it kind of shows the move that operators are having in terms of really driving a lot what's happening in the space. And also, next quote there from Verizon in terms of the fact that no one is completely comfortable yet with this move towards virtualization. But that's okay, because it is a movement that everybody's kind of taking at the same pace, and so it's something that's kind of a learning experience for everybody. So there is some bit of uncomfortableness so far, but I think it seems like everybody is okay with that at this point. And as we move along this journey, people become more comfortable with it. So interesting insight there. One other topic we looked at was obviously vendors are going to be a big part of this. Telecom operators not alone and trying to find balance in the new world of virtualization. Vendors are having to deal with new business models, new service models in terms of coming to grips with this new movement towards virtualization. There's been an initial reluctance, some had mentioned, by some vendors out there, but that has given way to new business opportunities and models that those companies I think are realizing are possible in this new environment. So that initial reluctance seems to be fading away as operators or vendors realize the new opportunities out there for the market. But again, this is all still an evolving process, and we expect this to continue to kind of change over the next couple of years as we move deeper into this space. One thing we looked at in the report, we dug into one service, which was virtualized voice, as kind of a harbinger for how we're moving towards the service assurance models. It does seem like some operators out there are looking to launch packet-based voice services using a virtualized model. And that is an interesting way to do it. It does provide definitely some challenges for service assurance, because voice, I think, as we all know, is very sensitive to network quality, and seems like using voice over a packet network is a good way to kind of test those theories. So that's going to be a big part of this. We talked with quite a few people who mentioned that this will really kind of show the I guess, resolve and the ability for service assurance platforms to handle this move towards virtualization. Obviously, any sort of issues with the network when it comes to voice services will be readily apparent to consumers, and so that'll be a good test for these platforms moving forward. And quickly to the conclusion there, so we can get to our experts on this topic. Obviously, despite the challenges brought on by the move towards a greater reliance on software, there's obviously a lot at stake for operators in moving down this path, and it seems like the momentum is going in that direction. So there's little doubt we are going to make this, or the industry is going to make this work at some point. There will be perhaps some hiccups along the way, but there's enough resolve, it seems like, that the smart people out there will make all this work in the end of the day. In terms of the ability for service assurance platforms to handle the needs of these deployment models, That is definitely a journey that's continuing. Obviously, we expect, and from people we talked to in the report, they expect quite a bit of advances to happen over the next year or two on this. There's still some issues that need to be worked out in terms of standards and cooperation amongst vendors and carriers out there. But it did seem like from those we talked to that those issues are being resolved, and we are moving pretty rapidly towards a common goal in terms of service assurance models for these virtualized platforms. And the market might not be ready today for these large-scale rollouts, but it appears it's only a matter of time. And so that kind of goes back to the previous conclusions that, again, we might not be quite ready for this today. There are some commercial deployments out there happening, but they are somewhat limited still. But the progress is being made. And as you'll hear from the other people on the panel today, there's some good enthusiasm and good progress being made on this. So it's just a matter of time before we see greater commercial deployments of these services. So that is a quick conclusion and a quick overview of the report, as I mentioned. And again, you can check out that report on the RCR Wireless site. Should be up there later on today with some more insight in there as well. But with that, I want to move on to the experts here to get some better insight on the topic. And so what we'll do is we'll bring on Greg Collins first. And before we get to Greg, I also want to remind those listening in that if you have any questions for our panel members, to please use the questions tab there on the panel, and we can get to those questions at the end of the webinar. But with that, I want to bring on Greg Collins, who's the founder and principal analyst at Exact Ventures, to provide a bit of an overview on the topic. So Greg, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Hello, everyone. I know we have a lot of panelists today, so I'll try to go through everything really quickly. As Dan mentioned, I'm an industry analyst, and I produce very quantitative reports that measure and forecast a variety of core networking topics. So if you look at the next slide, it gives you a list of some of the areas that I cover. And nearly all the areas that I cover, from a vendor market share basis and a forecasting basis, are all being affected by this shift to NFV and cloud. And a little bit later on, I'll take a look at a few of the markets to sort of share what I think the sort of the stages of this migration are, and to quantify it a little bit. Moving on to the next slide. As it's obvious to everyone, NFV is a massive generalization, generational transition. This is a decade, multiple decade long type of shift in architecture and business process. And in looking at the markets, currently NFV revenues are currently very small, but bookings are gaining momentum. Contracts are getting signed, but nearly all the RFI, the RFP, and roadmap activity is just dominated by NFV. We're seeing, proof of concepts. I mean, if we were to think back a year, 18 months ago, the focus was on POCs, proof of concepts. And now we're at the point where a lot of these are moving into trials. And I think that's where maybe the progress slows down a bit. In converting from trials to operations will take a long time, just given the magnitude of all the changes involved with the new technologies and the new organizations, telecom and networking and data center. All organizations all need to work together and understand the relationships in order to get these technologies moving. And with the hype phase, I mean, we all tend to fall in love with the technologies, but we tend to overlook a lot of the organizational issues associated with the change. And I think right now we're really starting to focus on those organizational changes to really move NFV to mainstream. So next I'll take a look at one of the specific markets that I track. So this is for IMS, and IMS largely supports voice over LTE and RCS and a bunch of other session-based communication services. You can see the sort of the three different types of architectures I currently forecast and track. So physical is the sort of the current physical products. Virtual is just software only that runs on top of a virtual machine, and cloud would build on top of what is a virtual type of solution and include things like orchestration, service chaining, and that type of thing. So I see, sort of three distinct steps in this transition. If we look at sort of what the actual market did in 2015, there was about $3.5 billion in IMS revenue, and virtually none of it was based on virtual or cloud. But over the coming years, I have the total market growing at about 19% CAGR, growing to around $5.5 billion in 2020, and with over half of that in 2020 being cloud and virtual. So right now it's the market is very small, but clearly this is the direction that the market's headed. Dan mentioned the hybrid, the need to support hybrid networks, and the physical networks certainly not going away anytime soon. I'm sure a lot of the big operators aren't interested in writing off billions and billions of their network, so we'll still have a lot of physical networking equipment around for a long time. So it'll be really important to leverage that as much as possible. Next, I'll take a look at how the value is sort of getting redistributed with NFV. So I talked about some of the areas that I covered before. So virtual EPC, virtual IMS, virtual session border controllers, and virtual PCRF. All of those, very strong markets going forward. And I have the VNF being, between 70 and 80% of the total value of this market. VNFI being 10 to 15%, and the nano layer being around 10 to 15% as well. This wouldn't include services revenue, so professional services would add another very big chunk on top of that, and that's will obviously be a very important part of vendor revenues and the market, as knitting all of these different VNFs together, and VNF managers and orchestration layers are really important. That works very strongly together. So lastly, on the last slide, just to sum up, the service assurance is critical in moving this technology to the mainstream. The complexity of many of the layers of software and hardware, plus the organizational and cultural changes, really magnify the amount of change that's going on. And even as you move from virtual to cloud, there could be even further decomposition of the VNFs into to microservices, parsing each VNF between control and data planes, having sort of stateless applications, and all of that adds to the complexity. And new technologies plus old processes might not mesh well, and so I think it's really important that that operators and vendors really start don't try to necessarily shoehorn all of these new technologies into an old way of doing things, but look to new things as well. And DevOps seems to be the type of organization and process that will really add to the speed and agility to developing new applications and features, and to solve problems as well. And with that, I'm just about out of time, so I will turn it back over to Chris. Thank you.
Sure, I'll jump in here first against Dan Meyer. And again, I want to, just so everybody knows, I'm the one who's controlling the slides, and so I apologize for all of my bad slides. This is not the presenters, it's all me, so I'll take all the blame for that. But yeah, so before we get to Chris here from AT&T, I also want to remind those listening in that if you do have any questions for our panel members, and obviously Greg's presentation there was pretty good. A little, again, we have more insight as well in the report, but if you have any questions or want some more follow-up there with Chris, you can feel free, or with Greg, feel free to use the questions tab there on the panel, and we can get to those questions at the end of the webinar here. But But again, thanks, Greg, for the overview there. It's obviously showing that there is quite a bit still needs to happen in the market, but again, we're evolving and we expect a big things from the market going forward. So with that, I want to bring on now Chris Rice. He's the VP of Advanced Technologies and Architecture at AT&T to provide some insight from the carriers. So Chris, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, Dan. Good to be here. Thank you. And Greg did a nice job. So let's go on to the next slide. I just want to start off with kind of what I'll call like the classic service assurance diagram. And, I've simplified this quite a bit just to talk through it pretty quickly. But obviously you have the network layer down below, and I'm lumping all the data plane, control plane, signaling all together. And then there are all the systems, right, that are the classic systems from the element management system, network management system, operational support system, and kind of billing support system. And then there's these data elements, if you will, that kind of come up, or data information that comes up to the next layer around network performance, around inventory, around specific VNFs or specific network elements, probing, alarm, event information, all that kind of stuff feeds into a service management and analytic area. That's typically where you compute KPIs, key performance indicators, you do your analysis on service level agreements, you want to put in automation, metrics that really occurs there. And then kind of the users, if you will, of that service layer could be suppliers, because maybe you have specific SLAs with them, or customers, for the SLAs that they have with you, ecosystem partners, and then specifically around the field support and care workforce as well. So that's kind of the classic diagram. The needs of all those kind of people at the top, they don't go away. The needs to monitor those pieces of information don't go away, but certainly it changes as we move into this virtual world. And one way we prepared for that, really before this virtualization started, this is probably almost 10 years ago, we took an approach around what we call service quality management, which was a new approach. Not that it wasn't necessary to have what I showed on the first diagram, but it wasn't necessarily sufficient. And so, there's some things that could occur, like, everybody thinks the network is fine, all the elements are working great, but for some reason the end-to-end connectivity isn't there because tables have changed, routes have changed, some other things have changed. And you really need to have this end-to-end visibility for the customer experience and how it relates to the network state. And that's really what service quality management is all about. It's really something that AT&T pioneered. And it's really, the whole purpose is to say, what's my service, or really what's the customer service experience, as opposed to kind of a pure network-centric view. Now, the good news is, kind of for us, it's fortuitous, that this works across the physical world and the virtual world, and for us, that's domain 1, domain 2. And it also works across different vendor pieces of equipment, because again, you're taking an end-to-end view. So the rest of that stuff almost looks like more of a black box. You're kind of looking at flows that are in between it. Right, and so when Greg made the point about we're going to have this hybrid service, and Dan did, this hybrid world of physical and virtual for some time, that's definitely true. And that's why it's important to have capabilities and technology like this that allows us to be able to do these kind of functions, do service assurance in that hybrid world, because it's a fact that it'll be around for some time to come. And then our goal here is essentially to create intelligence about the way the customer is seeing the service, resulting in even further improved customer experience and reduce network and care costs. Right, so let's go on to the next slide.
All right.
And really, so what becomes new in the virtual world? Well, if we take this concept, we had service quality management, its goals where I talked about it again before, which is bringing the customer experience to the forefront of how we design and operate networks. It was data-driven, kind of analytics-based. It was network vendor and domain independent and had benefits to our customer. But the repairs were typically manual in the way they were done, just by the way the network was set up. As we actually move into this physical world, as we move into this closed loop world within our ECOMP, which Dan mentioned, which stands for Enhanced Control, Orchestration, Management, and Provisioning. And it's essentially our VNF automation layer. So if you think about what Greg had showed, it's that layer up top. I think he called it Nano, but it's really Nano plus plus that covers other areas. But really what you want to do is automate the intelligence that are taking in response to network and infrastructure conditions. And you're, again, putting customer experience at the forefront just like before, but what you really want to be able to do is to say, can I take these and can I make based on policies, based on data that I'm collecting? Can I make these repairs, some of them in an automated way? And can I do it more intelligently? So can I decide whether I can maybe restart an application or rebuild or migrate, right? Which are really options I didn't have before in the other world. And so let's go to the next slide just real quick, Dan. So this is just a basic idea of how would you do some kind of flow like this, and how do you use this capability, this DNF automation layer, the eComp layer that we talk about, and then how do you combine it with service quality management, right? So how do you get the best of both of these things that we've been working on? So you have that analytic layer that I talked about, service quality analytics up there in the top left area. And then there's like, you certainly have the network state. You understand the network state from the data you're collecting and eComp analytics and other things. And you can see the management environment we have down there, the managed environment, which includes compute, networking, storage, obviously the DNFs and the application, and the measurement itself. Make sure the measurement itself is up and running, right? That's an important concept that sometimes people miss. And so that information then feeds up in through the service metrics for both the virtual world as well as the physical. That's what the PNF stands for. So you have the analytics, you have that information, and then you're saying, well, do I understand that there are any kind of silent service anomalies? Are there any issues that are occurring in the infrastructure? And then you say, well, if I have that, and I can codify what I know as a network operator and how to run this network, I can put that in a policy. And I can make complex decisions, or complex logic in that box just to the right of the service quality management area about what to do. Now, it might be such that, hey, this is pretty complex. I'm not 100% sure what to do. I'm going to go in the top. I'm going to take the high road there, go to the ticket, and I'm going to bring it up to someone who's looking at it, an operator, and then we might take a human action, right? And then we can learn from those human actions to really then ideally take the low road below that, which is, hey, I've seen this before. I know what to do. I can apply an action, and I can automate the correction. I can automate what I need to do to make repairs. Right, and that's something that's really starting to become more and more available in the software-defined networking world. And the only thing I want to say, just as a kind of a wrap-up, while I think there are some other folks who are looking and doing POCs, but we at the end of 2015, AT&T had converted 5.7% of our target network to SDN and NFV, and that might not sound like a lot. It's certainly relatively small compared to 100%. But when you look at the size of our network and the scope and everything else that Greg mentioned, it's actually a pretty fair. That's much beyond a POC. I can promise you that. So you're rolling out. How you're doing DevOps, how you're doing operations in the real world as you do that. And we have a goal to get to 30% by the end of this year, and we're well on our way to do that. So anyway, I'll just end with that, and then I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thanks, Dan.
Perfect. That sounds great. Yeah, definitely. As Chris mentioned, the automation aspect of all of this, again, was an important part of the report as well, but that is going to be a huge part of this moving forward. And again, with all this information coming through these virtualized networks, it really is going to be reliant on automation being a huge part of this moving forward. And that's going to be a big part. And again, still some challenges there, but it seems like moving in the right direction. So yeah, thanks, Chris, so much. Great insight there. It's always good to hear from AT&T. I think we're all aware of AT&T is kind of driving a lot of this here. So great insight there. And also, for those who are listening in, if you've got any questions for Chris or any of our panel members, please, again, feel free to use the questions tab there to send in those questions, and we'll get to those here shortly at the end of the webinar. But again, thanks, Chris, for the insight. Definitely appreciate it. So with that, I want to now bring on Vikram Saxena from NetScout to provide a little overview of the company and how they participate in the space here. So Vikram, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar. I'll give a perspective from NetScout's point of view, and then I'll give you a clue to move the slide, so make it easier for you rather than guesswork. So on the first slide, I think just quickly to summarize what we do, NetScout has a long history of focusing on service assurance for over 30 years, and we have done that both for service providers and the enterprise segment. On the service provider side, we have been engaged in most of the strategic initiatives around mobile, broadband, voice and IMS, video, business services, as well as data center and IT applications. What we bring to the table, our unique approach in service assurance, is based on extracting high-value metadata from network traffic in a very distributed manner, and then sending this data to a variety of service assurance applications which are used for either optimizing network performance, managing application performance, enhancing security from a network and application layer, or to gain insights into how the end users are experiencing this service. So we believe our approach has helped us deliver our solution at a better scale with the least amount of complexity to provide high quality insights to our customers. Next slide, Dan.
Yep.
So as previous panelists have spoken, as we move into the virtualization world, I think there are many challenges which we haven't quite faced in the physical world. And just to name a few, these networks are highly dynamic and agile. I think that's one difference. In the physical world, changes used to take on the order of days or months, in order to affect changes in the network. But a virtualized network, this becomes very dynamic and agile. So changes could be taking place on the order of minutes or hours, but certainly not days and months. VNFs can be created on demand. VNFs can certainly move between machines as your workload changes. You can scale these VNFs up and down by dynamically assigning resources. The service chains themselves can be created on demand as customers, create and set up different services. So from a service assurance point of view, what this means is in such a dynamic and agile world, the instrumentation has to be such that we can provide uninterrupted visibility across your entire end-to-end service layer, which is the main challenge, I think, before we get to the application layer. So from a visibility point of view, what we have learned over the last few months through different trials and POCs is there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We need a suite of different options that can be tailored to what our customers are trying to do. And I've listed a few of these here just for the sake of discussion. Back on the previous slide then. Yeah, so one approach is to embed your instrumentation agent along with the VNF itself. So this allows you to get a basic set of KPIs and also allows movement between virtual machines as the VNFs move. It's particularly suited for public cloud where you don't have access to hypervisors and vSwitches. The second option is where we can provide what we call a passive probing function running its own virtual machine. And in this case, we need access to the vSwitch to set up mirroring to capture packets. Now, in this kind of environment, we can provide more capabilities and more service assurance functions and KPIs to be able to provide this. But it gets a little complex when you deal with the motion of VNFs themselves and how do we provide visibility on an uninterrupted basis. The final option I've shown is what we call an active agent. So this is an area where it may not be feasible to continuously capture packets, but on demand, you may be able to inject synthetic traffic into the network and measure performance between applications or on an end-to-end basis and verify service availability and set alerts and things like that. So I think to give this 360-degree uninterrupted visibility, we need a variety of options to do that. And NetScout, we have learned from our experience, and now we have expanded our product suite to do that. Next slide, Dan. So finally, I want to end with talking about some of the use cases, and these have been mentioned by previous speakers as well. So the first one is around hybrid networks, and the classic example is voice over LTE, because this is a scenario where a voice call can start on a physical network and end on a virtual network. But nevertheless, from a service assurance point of view, we need to hide those details and be able to provide your service layer KPIs without worrying about where the call is originating and terminating. So what we call this as service assurance continuity between physical and the virtual world. And this is a very important aspect that we are learning in this process. The second one, which is all about automation and closed loop, I think Chris and others have talked about this. So this is an area where the real thing that's important is the timeliness of the data. Because you want to effect changes on a relatively faster time scale, having access to real-time data, real-time metrics, to be able to drive your orchestration layer in an on-demand fashion, I think this is very key. And the way we collect metadata in a distributed fashion allows us to be as real-time as possible to feed this automated closed-loop systems to drive changes on demand. The final use case that I've used is, there is a component of these technologies where new services are being created, which have no corresponding equivalence in the physical world, where, and I use an example of a virtual CPE business service where the services are created and downloaded on the fly as customers demand these. And in this complex dynamic environment, to provide support for SLAs and so on, we need monitoring agents that can be also deployed on demand, can also be configured to monitor specific applications on the fly, and then to be able to support these on-demand services. So I think we are very excited about this notion of creating new services where service assurance is kind of built into the service itself, and these are then used to provide an enhanced user experience to customers. So these are some of the examples of use cases that we've been involved in that we think are essential in delivering value to service providers. So with that, I thank you, and
Perfect.
And I will hand it off to Dan.
Thanks so much, Vikram. I appreciate the insight there. And obviously, Vikram will be part of the Q&A panel at the end here. So if anybody has any questions for Vikram or any of the other panel members, please feel free to use the questions tab there and send those in, and we'll get to those at the end. But Vikram, thanks so much for the insights. Now I want to bring on Ehab from EXFO to talk a bit about EXFO as well. Thanks, Ehab, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Could you please, next slide, please?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think here I would like to more focus on what are the steps or stages that we think or we're seeing service providers are going through to actually reach that final goal of revenue, creating or generating revenues faster, and the DevOps approach of reducing the time, reducing the cost, and enable the innovation. This is not going to happen day one. Some customers are going through these steps either in parallel or one step at a time. But we see the first step is opening the network, reduce the cost by virtualizing network function that was physical, now they are software. And there's a big challenge there of how can you keep the same resiliency, performance, behavior, and make sure that the change in the behavior of the VNF is not impacting the user experience. So in here we help customer in continuously creating a solution that basically makes sure that every time you upgrade the software, every time you there is an event that happened to do switchover or redundancy, to actually the behavior doesn't impact the user experience, whether it's going through fully virtual components or a hybrid virtual and physical. And there, all the components of service assurance, passive, active, and analytics, they can be combined together to provide this facility to manage the new virtualized network. The second phase, this is where we start opening the different service assurance components like monitoring or correlation to become API in a standard way, so that the service providers can start to scale the solution and go from just making sure that there is no impact of the virtualization on the user experience to actually automate some process like certification of the service, like providing some portal interface to customers to enable them to become part of the operation. But it's also really transforming the service assurance from silos that was doing a very specific function to a very specific group to open APIs and services, whether it's passive monitoring or active monitoring or a combination of both, in addition to the complex correlation of events between the network and the cloud, or the network service chain and the cloud, and opening this API to the higher layer. Then finally, the final phase is how you enrich the DevOps dashboards. There is a lot of innovation here to actually how to do that. How can you provide all these services in a very user-friendly way? It's not just user-friendly, but also understand the network model. And we all understand, we all know that these network models will be created on the fly in an agile way, meaning, the network model will be added expanded, adding new components, adding new services. So how can every time you change that model, you actually provide a new set of capabilities to the DevOps dashboard so that you can enrich the developed product with also operation capabilities like troubleshooting, monitoring, and even extend that to the end user or the customer to actually do some of these operations themselves. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So if we actually look at the life cycle of service assurance within a service, it's actually not changing. There is a pre-launch testing, there is new service validation, certification and birth certificate for some of the services, and finally troubleshooting. The same life cycle will exist as today will also exist in the virtual world or the DevOps. The difference is that this is all combined part of the in an agile way, part of the service creation and management, which means that all these capabilities need to be broken down into microservices and APIs that can be integrated and enriching this overall service automation. So this is really the transformation going in the service assurance industry, or in particularly in EXFO, in how we transform service assurance to help the customer throughout these 3 steps or 3 evolution steps to finally go from saving costs to reduce operation costs to finally increase revenue by creating services in the most cheap way and the best operational way.
Perfect. That sounds great. Well, yeah, but definitely appreciate the insight on that today. Thanks so much for that. And again, yeah, we'll be part of the Q&A session here coming up here very shortly. So if you got any questions for Ehab or for any other panel members, please feel free to send those in using the questions tab there on the screen, and we'll get to those at the end. But again, yeah, thanks so much for the time on that. And finally, I want to bring in Bala, who's with HPE, to talk a bit about the company as well for a quick introduction. So hey, Bala, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan. I guess the advantage is to going last. I don't need to do a lot of setup slides, so I'll get straight into my 2 slides. I have really put in 2 slides. One is more strategic, talks about how we see the functions evolving, and the second one is a bit more tactical, talks about how we are looking at it from our own product strategy. So let's get straight into it. The first slide, right? So we see the OSS and more particularly the service assurance function evolving in 3 distinct steps. The first one, which is fairly unanimous, is this idea of closed loop automation between the full service fulfillment and service assurance functions. It obviously helps automatic healing using the ability to scale it as a service. And what we're doing here is assurance is modeled along with the service graph, and service instantiation will comprise both assurance monitoring, collection, processing. That entire cycle is built into single process. The detection of problems can then be deterministic. It can be defined with the model, or it can be probabilistic, defined by anomaly detections. The second stage is really an evolved model-driven approach. And when we say model here, it's actually more of a service graph. And what we're doing here is more than just using a common database or common data structures. The model, as we see it, is really it comprises it comprises not only of objects, but it also has the relationships and the policies built into it. So it's very intent-driven. And the way we define these models, the policies and relationships are built into these descriptors innately. So that allows these service descriptors, as we call it, to be very dynamic and cope with future state autonomously, so that it knows what its current state is, it knows what its desired state should be, and it is able to automatically compute the delta between that current state and this target state and create a run book at runtime, so that there's automatic network graph creation, automatic configuration action, and automatic detection of anomalies and corrective actions. And the reason we think this is really important for this model to be intelligent and have more than, use just more than common data is because NFV-based services or software-defined services, they have a very high level of agility, and assurance will never be able to cope up with this agility if it's not already defined into the model. So assurance has to become a design task, an intrinsic part of the modeling, and not an integration task, right? The third step really is to, the best models will not be able to keep the inventory completely accurate to down to every millisecond of it. So a model can define only a deterministic problem detection based on the expected data. So that really takes us to this last step of really augmenting this. So both the fulfillment and assurance functions with a high level of intelligence. So that provides additional value to both these processes. It allows more probabilistic problem detections and very predictive service assurance. Analytics, as you can imagine, will definitely play a big role here. It can help the model to detect symptoms of unexpected anomalies. So if you bring the fulfillment and assurance together, it's a closed loop. If you bring in intelligence and assurance, it can help simplify that problem detection and automation. If you bring the fulfillment and intelligence together, it's very useful in optimizing resource usage. But when you bring it all together, then you really have a sustainable, self-learning, automated, model-driven approach. I see it as the difference between really giving a man a fish and teaching him how to fish. So this is much more sustainable in the long term, so that the model is completely self-learning eventually, that it is able to focus on, like Chris said, the focus is on the service health. It's more about making sure that the system can detect majority of the problem before the customer perceives it in the service level. So it's more about quality of experience for the customer as opposed to just the plain quality of service definitions that we have been used to. Next slide, please. This slide is really, as I said, much more of a tactical slide. It talks about how we approach the OSS evolution in general and the service orchestration more particularly. So we see this as a three-tiered management approach, which is very similar to some of the slides that were shown earlier. So there's a virtual infrastructure management piece and the physical infrastructure management piece that already exists. There's a second layer where in the NFV world it correlates to the VNF management functions. And we have a product called NFV Director that takes care of that. It's a NFV orchestration and the VNF manager. And what we have really done with the third layer, the topmost layer, is really have a service orchestration layer that actually cuts across both the virtual infrastructure and the physical infrastructure. And we modeled it to be very relevant to the hybrid infrastructure that will exist for the foreseeable future, so that the service orchestration layer is actually layered on top of not only the NFV operations, but also on top of the existing assets that are already in place for standard operations. So it can take in the existing frameworks of performance management and fault management into it, and then create really a layer at the service level that can monitor and assure service quality at that service level, and it does across a hybrid infrastructure. So not only across the virtual part of it, but this really cuts across the entire operations level. So that's where we see that going.
Very good. All right. Well, perfect. Well, we definitely appreciate all the insight there from HPE as well on the topic. We do have a few minutes left here, about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience, and definitely want to get all the panel members back involved in this. But again, I want to thank those for sending questions, and we do have a few questions lined up here. And the ones that we don't get to, we'll make sure we share with the panel members as well for some follow-up afterwards. But I always like to include the first question sent in for sure. So the first question that came in, and this one I think I might gear towards Greg. Someone's asking about, obviously, when it comes to a lot of this movement towards virtualization and assurance, the OSS part of this is a big part for operators. As they move towards virtualization, it's a big movement there. I guess maybe from Greg, I guess who do you see as some of the players who are providing support systems for this movement? And do you think traditional vendors are to expand their offerings, or are new players going to come into the market to take over these support systems? So I don't know, Greg, if you've seen some changes there in terms of vendors in the OSS space.
So thanks, Dan. Thanks for the question. I think all of the traditional OSS vendors are playing in the space. What's interesting to me, and I really focus on the VNFs. That's really my focus. It's do the VNF vendors kind of try to move up and play a bigger, more active role in Mano and then the BSS and OSS, and we've really seen some of that. But I really think that sort of the BSS, OSS vendors, and then the Mano vendors will really begin to take more dominant roles ultimately in the networks, because they're the ones kind of in the best position to oversee everything and to act as sort of the alpha vendor, if you will. To integrate and to be the one neck to choke if something goes wrong.
Yes, it's always important to have someone there to take responsibility for that. So that makes sense. Well, another question. This one I'm gonna gear towards Chris. This kind of brings in a bit of kind of what AT&T's been doing out there. But someone's asking, how do you see the impact of IoT on service assurance? Now I know Chris at AT&T, obviously you guys have a pretty large and growing IoT business as well. And I guess how do you guys approach the issues of service assurance, I guess, in that environment? Is that a big change, or how do you guys, I guess, view that movement there?
Yeah, I mean, at least for thanks, Dan. I think at least for us, the IoT is something that's a similar kind of service. You can still do it in this service quality management way that I described. I think maybe the root of the question is around, for really, really kind of low end devices, what do you do? And typically, what you do is you look at it from a more system aspect, because typically those low-end devices come into some kind of gateway or something like that. And then what you do is you do service management in and around that gateway, and the IoT devices themselves, quite frankly, if they fail and they're really, really inexpensive, then you've probably made them redundant, and it's not the end of the world if they fail. On the higher end IoT devices, because IoT covers a lot of different things, you may have that capability built into the device itself, right? If you're monitoring a refrigerated car that's traveling across the world, and you're checking humidity and temperature and a whole bunch of other things, you're going to have a capability built into that device itself, but it'll have enough value, and it'll have enough compute power to be able to do that. So I think it really depends on what end of the spectrum you're talking about for IoT.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. IoT is, as we're kind of learning, is a very wide swath of business and use cases and devices. And so yeah, I guess being able to monitor what it actually needs is kind of the important part of how you deal with service assurance in the IoT space. So yeah, great point there. Let's see here. Now, there's a question about, someone was asking earlier about how effective are VNF probing capabilities now. And maybe this is something that we could bring on some of the vendors to talk about to kind of get their insight. And I guess, how do they see the technology in terms of probes? Because obviously that's a big part of this move for service assurance in a virtualized world, is having probes that can handle this huge amount of data coming across these networks. So maybe Vikram, I guess, do you have any maybe insight on how you see, I guess, the probing capabilities at this point in terms of VNFs right now?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I can certainly address that. I think we have learned a lot over the past 2 years as we've gone through, trials and POCs and so on. So this is indeed a challenging problem, because in the hardware world, we had a lot of resources at our disposal to be able to provide very extensive layer 4 through 7 service layer functionality and KPIs. But what you find in an NFV environment is that because you're sharing resources, and things are constantly agile and moving, it becomes an extremely challenging problem to provide higher layer visibility. DPDK, as is mentioned in the question, I think is necessary, but I don't believe it's sufficient. So we had to do a lot of optimization, even in our software, to be able to do what we call acceleration of our own layer 4 through layer 7 processing capability to provide KPIs. So we have made a lot of progress, but we had to go beyond DPDK to be able to get that level of visibility into the application layers and above. But this has been a challenging problem indeed, and quite a learning exercise. But I think the industry as a whole has made progress here.
Interesting. I don't know, Ahab, if you got any insight there, maybe what you're seeing, anything different from what Vikram's seeing in the market today in terms of probes out there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So we see, similar to the previous speaker, we see also that technology, there is definitely optimization and re-architecting of the probes themselves to deal with the acceleration. But we also see that there will be in the NIC cards and the hardware through standard approach, also acceleration that is needed. This is not a problem that is only probes are facing. This is really any VNFs that you take it from its own environment to the cloud will require acceleration, require some requirements. So we see the industry is moving toward that direction as well through Owen Lab and different other innovation center to really address that problem.
Makes sense. Okay, and maybe Bala, I want to make sure I get some insight there from HP on it. I guess, are you seeing anything different there, maybe than what we've heard from NetScout and EXFO on that as well?
No, I think this one was pretty well covered by both Vikram and Ahab. So I think we can probably take another question.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds good. Well, I know obviously we got a question in here. Maybe we can go with Bala for this one here. Someone's asking about, I guess, how do you see the SDN controller being used to institute the closed loop for monitoring and policy management? I guess any view on maybe on that question there, maybe what you see the abilities there for an SDN controller?
I think the SDN controller really is becoming a part of the management hierarchy there. It's essentially now it's essentially the virtual infrastructure management for the networking part of the virtualized infrastructure. And the great thing about it is most carrier SDN products actually can cover not only virtualized infrastructure, but also existing infrastructure. So it becomes a common point from which we can actually get a lot of data about the state of the virtualized network and the physical network, and that can, and as it integrates into this higher level of management hierarchy, it kind of becomes a simplified point from which we can get data from a complex network underlying it. So without an SDN controller, it would have been much complex to model data collection from a really complex underlying infrastructure. So I think that's the way, to put it simply, that's how SDN controller really is making this much more, much easier and much more palatable in the broader scheme of things.
Makes sense. And maybe you have maybe a comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, we see a need, not just for the SDN controller, but we see a need of coordination and orchestration of probing in general. I think really to open up and have the DevOps dashboards or the logic, the programmability of the network on the top, you definitely need to abstract all the aspects of monitoring. So monitoring turned to become a service, and the SDN controller provides some input to that. But I think this is a general aspect that we see is going to happen in the market, is that the monitoring as a service is something that definitely required to keep that higher layer of service creation completely pure from what probe, where probe, how it works, all that. It really need to get data about certain service from one time to time, or initiate or coordinate some kind of complex monitoring setup. That definitely need to be abstracted.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. And then maybe quickly, one final question. This one's the last one that came in here, maybe for Chris here. Someone asking about the open source part in terms of AT&T, of the e-comp project. I don't know, Chris, if you've got any quick insight on that. I think we've seen some news recently from AT&T on open source, but I don't know if you have maybe a quick response there on that question there.
Yeah, I mean, so we did commit to open source e-comp through the Linux Foundation. You know, there's about 8.5 million lines of code within e-comp today. So this is not something that we're just going to bundle up overnight and put on GitHub. And there's some work to do. You know, we're working with the Linux Foundation. They're experts in this area. But I mean, you know, you've got the, you know, issues around the open sourcing of the code itself. Then there's what's the governance body? Put a technical committee together. What would the working groups look like? What are, you know, the different types of working groups? Yeah. You know, you got to be able to go through and talk about, well, who are the initial members? What would that structure look like? What would your, you know, CI/CD environment? So there's a lot of stuff that you know, you have to go through to make this happen. So, you know, I think to quote John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach, we're going to be quick, but we're not going to rush. We're not going to do this in a way, because, you know, this is something that, you know, as you saw everybody comment, right, this is something for the long term. Yeah. This is thing that's going to be around for a while, and we want this to be a true unifying effort for the industry, because we think that there's benefits for the whole ecosystem, right, the vendors as well as the service providers. Yeah. So, you know, our goal is to do this right, and we're going to be doing that over the next, you know, few months with them, and you know, we'll take their counsel, but yeah, we're committed to doing it, and we're actively working on it. That sounds great. Yeah, I think the open source community, that's a whole different topic that I think we'll be covering here soon in another webinar as well, but that's a big part of this moving forward. But again, I want to thank everyone. I think we're just about out of time here. We got to most of the questions, not all of them, but we will be sharing those questions with our panel members for potential follow-up afterwards individually. So again, I want to thank all of our audience members for sending those in. Also, let everybody know that this webinar will be archived on the rcrwireless.com site here shortly for those that might have missed some of it. And please check out our feature report on the topic as well. That'll be available on our site here shortly as well. But again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thanks to Greg, Chris, Vikram, Ihab, and Bala for providing great insight. Thanks so much, everyone, for the time and insight. We definitely appreciate that. And again, thanks everyone for joining, and have a good afternoon.